Welcome to episode 22 of my guide to video game history. In the early 90s, gaming was starting to get another dimension, with the possibility of creating virtual worlds that gamers could enter. Of course, 3D gaming had been around for some time in one form or another, but by developing a helmet with TV screens, the idea of being fully immersed in a game was becoming a real possibility. Called virtual reality, the idea had been around since 1968 and had continued with Jaron Lanier and his company VPL Research setting the standard and popularising the concept in 1985. But by the early 90s, computers had become powerful enough and the technology cheap enough for virtual reality to be commercially viable. One of the main companies to achieve this was done by UK's Dr. John Walden and his Leicester company, Virtuality, set up in 1987. Their principal aim was to bring virtual reality to the masses, and with gaming experts all predicting it was the future, gaming excitement was rife. So, fueled by the buzz of such films as Lawn Mower Man in 1992, and armed with talented programmers such as ex-Rare member Matt Wilkinson and Don McIntyre, they set to work creating an impressive array of games over a relatively short time. Their first was called Dactyl Nightmare, that had you negotiate a surreal world collecting orbs and shooting fellow players. Meanwhile, a pterodactyl would fly about and attack random players. Other highlights was Legend Quest, a sword and sorcery fantasy game. Then there was Trap Master, and then Zone Hunter, another shooter, which had you play a futuristic warrior, and then there was Ghost Train, which made things easier by giving you a shooter but on rails. But as the 90s progressed, interest began to wane, and with the hugely costly machines failing to do well in the arcades. The reason really was that the quick turnaround of the arcades was totally at odds with the immersive world of VR. After all, who's going to pay £3 to wear a sweaty helmet, look like an idiot, and then die in 3 minutes because you hadn't worked out how to play it yet? Also, with the extreme cost of the machines and the speed improvement in graphics meant that machines became quickly obsolete and made arcade owners shun them. It's a shame really that Virtuality didn't try for a different type of business model, such as pay-per-hour machines or the more exploratory-based gaming, as still to this day it is the closest that we've become to the tantalising world of VR gaming. It's also sad that some of the company's best games would arrive at the end of its life, when the VR craze had moved on. They released Buggy Ball, a madly addictive football game with buggies that was a great multiplayer experience. And they even started to create Pikmin VR, which sadly was unreleased. This let you play the yellow hungry one himself as you chomp your way through the mazes. Finally, an interesting spin-off for the company was the development of the home VR system for the Atari Jaguar and a game called Missile Command 3D. Sadly, the struggling Jaguar failed to release the 3D device, and although the game was indeed released, it was released without the VR element, and so lost much of its original charm, and so would pass many gamers by. Anyway, back to the home consoles. In the previous episode we looked at the release of Sony's new machine and the Sega Saturn, but also joining the console war would be Nintendo themselves with their new console. They may have been late to the party, but they certainly had made themselves heard. The machine concept had started way back in 1993, when Silicon Graphics chairman Jim Clark went to Nintendo offering to co-develop a graphics chip for their new console. As Silicon Graphics was known for their high-end graphic workstations that was used in cutting-edge film special effects such as Jurassic Park and Terminator 2, as well as the most professional flight simulators, Nintendo gladly accepted. Originally called Project Reality, it had Genyo Takeda, who had been Nintendo's first game developer designing EVR Race, released in 1975, and Sheriff in 1979, and he went on to set up Nintendo's R&D 3 department, who would do such classics as Punch-Out and the battery backup, allowing NES cartridges to save games. For Nintendo's new console, he would take his R&D 3 department to work with Silicon Graphics on designing a new console, and also develop a new type of game controller to offer more immersion with the game. A task still held by the division today, with Takeda being instrumental with the design of the Wii. Over in Silicon Graphics, 70 employees were asked to work on the project, and they were under strict secrecy in what they were developing, with the only window to their office being covered by a large, giant Donkey Kong Country poster to stop curious fellow employees peering in. In October 1993, the official announcement that Nintendo was working with Silicon Graphics was released, and the gaming press and gamers started to get excited, dreaming of a movie-like graphics within their games. This was fueled further in 1994 when two arcade games released, Cruising in the USA and the game Killer Instinct, purported to use the same hardware as the consoles being released. By 1995, details of the console was announced, and now it was called the Ultra 64. Nintendo had brought the talents of Angel Studios and Paradigm, who were previously known for producing special effects in films and top-end flight simulators. Called the Dream Team, these developers were going to herald the future of gaming. Of course, at this time, Sega had released the Saturn and Sony the PlayStation, both of which gave impressive leaps of technology and wowing the world, as Nintendo seemed still quiet, only stating they were going to delay the launch until March 1996 to get the launch games perfect. So instead, in November 1995, the gaming press and gamers would get the Shoshinkai exhibition, showing the system now called the N64, changing the name when it transpired that Konami owned the trade name Ultra. The system impressed, although raised concerns that only 2 games were playable on the Ultra 64. There was Kirby Bowl, which was never actually released, and Mario 64. The other 11 games on display were only videos. But considering the machine was originally planned to be released in November, this seemed almost unforgivable. But Mario 64 was of course the star of the show, and had truly impressed with its graphics, which Nintendo said could even be improved still further, as it was only using bilinear interpolation, and the machine could do trilinear interpolation. These technical terms excited at the time, but basically meant that the level of smoothness applied to the graphic textures, giving the games an almost dreamlike, softened look as compared to the more pixelated graphics of the other consoles. Also, players were impressed with the new controller that had an analog stick, one of the first consoles to adopt an analog stick straight away, and a dizzying array of buttons for almost every type of game, which, when you combined with 4 game ports on the console, it was an exciting prospect for many. But for many gamers of the show, there was also concerns, especially with Nintendo's insistence to keep using cartridges instead of CDs. This would of course save Nintendo $50 on the manufacturing costs of the hardware, but it would make the games at least 3 times more expensive to manufacture than CD games, which when combined with the still higher license deals of Nintendo, made the decision to develop games on the system a real costly risk to take, especially when Sony's licensing setup of the CD console was so much better from the publisher's point of view. Because of this, many of the main publishers in Japan who had made their fortunes off of Nintendo, such as Namco, Konami, Capcom and Square, were depressingly absent from the initial third-party lineup, instead choosing to develop only for the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation. Megabytes of RAM may sound a lot, but in the new world of 3D definition textures and CD music, it seemed extremely constraining. On to 1996, things were becoming worrisome. Sony's PlayStation was doing exceptionally well, outselling all the competition. Meanwhile, Nintendo yet again had to announce another delay until June 1996. So it was on the 23rd of June 1996 the machine was finally released in Japan for 24,900 yen. It was released to some excitement due to the impressive launch titles, however. Mario 64 was of course the main launch title, which was not only good, but considered by many as one of the best games of all time. Shigeru Miyamoto had managed not only to bring Mario into the 3D realm, but would also write the book on how to do 3D platforming and how it should be done. Mario was frankly a joy to move around, perfectly complementing the N64 controller, with many, including myself, happy just to run Mario around the opening castle, enjoying the unprecedented freedom now available to us in the 3D gaming world. One of the most impressive points of the game, from a technical point of view, was the game's camera, which you viewed the game with. Held by Lakey, it swooped the camera to nearly always the right place, and where on the rare occasions the camera wasn't right, the player had the ability to move the camera themselves. The game was bursting with fun and ideas, and the extra dimension opened up the possibilities even further to the player, whilst remaining true to their 2D Mario game legacy. Edge magazine gave the game 10 out of 10, saying the world of video games had been changed forever. The other launch title was Pilot Wing 64, done by the company Paradigm, who had previously never written a game before, instead only known for their professional flight simulators. Whilst in development, the gaming press had been concerned whether Paradigm could actually write a game, considering they had no previous experience. They needn't have worried, as the game was excellent, taking all that was great about the SNES Classic, but actually improving upon it with more open-ended gameplay. Also, the graphics in the game were truly exceptional. Edge gave the game 9 out of 10, stating it was easily the most impressive 3D graphics ever seen in a video game. Over in the US, the machine would be released on the 29th of September 1996. Nintendo originally planned to release the console for $249.99, but they frantically dropped the price just before launch to $199.99 to match the Sony PlayStation console price, which had just dropped their own price. In December 1996, LucasArts released Star Wars Shadow of the Empire, set between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. It told of another group of heroes fighting the Empire. The game was massively hyped at the time, but on release was a huge disappointment, with graphics foggy and poor level design. Edge gave the game 6 out of 10. Incidentally, it had UK's Mark Haigh-Hutchinson as the lead designer, who had made a name for himself at LucasArts, working on Sam & Max Hits the Road game and Zombie Ate My Neighbours, as well as Dark Forces, and he would go on to do such classics as the Metroid Prime games for Retro Studios. Sadly, he died of cancer in 1998. In Europe, the machine was released on the 1st of March 1997, but for £249.99, making the console cost 60% more than what was being paid in the US. Realising this, Nintendo did drop the price to £199.99 a few months later, but of course this angered even more early adopters of the machine. The machine did sell well, especially in the US and Europe, although in Japan it did less well, where the lack of Japanese RPGs and Japanese third-party games dented its success. But Nintendo failed to make serious inroads against Sony's runaway success of the PlayStation. The main reason was the lack of third-party support, with publishers unwilling to take on the high risks of releasing a cartridge game, especially when not enough Nintendo machines have been sold to justify that risk. From the gamer's point of view, the hardcore gamer loved the machine, with many unique classic games being released for the console. But for the casual gamer and Nintendo's core demographic of 8 to 13 year olds, the cartridge prices of £50 to £70 were just too much. Especially for parents who would be busy buying a Sony PlayStation where the games were much cheaper and offered many more games. It made the choice of consoles a no-brainer. Also, the rampant delays of the Nintendo console being released meant that really it was too late in the day, with the Sony PlayStation allowed to establish too big a market share for Nintendo to hope to seriously win back control. Nintendo did try to combat some of this with releasing the 64DD peripheral that allowed gamers to play games on a zip drive, reducing costs, but quite frankly this was too little too late. Without any real support, it was released only in Japan and disappeared shortly afterwards, with only a few Nintendo games released for it. But despite all these factors resulting in the system not reaching its full potential, it still was a wonderful console and managed to sell 30 million consoles worldwide. It can hardly be declared a failure. It's just when compared to Nintendo's previous dominance, it was a shock. Still, it was a Nintendo machine, and that meant great Nintendo games. And its legion of exclusive developers on hand, such as Rare, releasing classic after exclusive classic, that not only were must-have games, but are still considered some of the best games of all time on many people's lists. Therefore, in the following section, I would like to mention some of these classic games as they were released. The first game of note was Wave Race 64, released in September 1996. It originally started out as a futuristic powerboat racer, but it was felt that it was too similar to another game in development called F-Zero X, and so at last minute they changed the game to present day and set it on a Paradise Island location where you raced jet skis instead. The game arrived with critical acclaim, with gamers impressed by the realistic water physics and great control of your jet ski. Nintendo Official Magazine gave the game 90%. Incidentally, it was programmed by Giles Goddard and Colin Reed, a duo of UK technical wizards who had previously worked at Argonaut Software, bringing the world Star Fox. They would also go on to bring Nintendo's game 1080 Degrees Snowboarding to help in the initial tech demo stages of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and Giles went on to do Doshin the Giant on the GameCube. Meanwhile, Colin Reed went on to program Pimkin on the GameCube as well. Anyway, back to other games. The next great release was Mario Kart 64, released in December 1996. This took all that was great about the SNES Classic, but updated it with lush 3D visuals and well-designed racetracks with lots of hidden secrets. But it was a 4-player multiplayer that the game really shined, offering the perfect game for a couple of mates to sit round a TV and play. Edge gave the game 8 out of 10. The following year, in 1997, would be the year Rare showed what they could do with a new Nintendo machine. The first game they released was a quirky and often overlooked game called Blast Corps, released in February that year. The game had you control a variety of vehicles with the express fun purpose of destroying the landscape as much as possible. This destroy everything was extremely satisfying, and with Rare parodying everything from Pac-Man to neat little touches of humour throughout that made you just want to play the game with a big smile on your face. Electronic Gaming Monthly gave the game 8.75 out of 10. Then in March, there was finally a more adult-orientated game released called Turok Dinosaur Hunter by Iguana Software. It was a first-person shooter based on the comic book that had you play a cross between Doom and Tomb Raider. It was popular on release, offering a welcome relief from all those mustachioed plumbers for gamers. The game divided critics, with some magazines such as Edge giving it 9 out of 10, whilst US magazines such as Electronic Games Monthly only gave the game 6.9. Then in April, Star Fox 64, or Lylat Wars as it was horribly known in Europe, was released. This continued the adventures of Fox McCloud and his happy band of wildlife wingmen. The game took the SNES classic and bettered it in almost every way, with more variations to the levels, smooth and detailed 3D visuals that just oozed atmosphere. It's also noted for being bundled with the Rumble Pack, one of the first used on any console. It allowed you to actually feel the vibrations of the crashes through the controller. Edge, quite rightly, gave the game 9 out of 10. But it was in August 1997, with the release of GoldenEye 007, that Nintendo would get that killer game that would entice the casual gamer away from Sony. Rare's second N64 game was a revelation, taking the James Bond license and not only releasing the best licensed game at the time, but also dragging the first-person shooter away from the PC and onto the consoles. The game had started life as a SNES game, with plans to be an on-rails shooter much in the same vein as Virtua Cop. It was only later on that they decided to make it truly free roaming. The game was stacked full of neat touches such as cool weaponry, such as the sniper rifle and the open-ended level designs that encouraged explorations. The game also has some different animations depending on what body part of the bad guys you shot. Common in today's game, but back then this was exciting concepts and actually changed how you play the game, as headshots would ensure quick and silent kills, bringing a stealth element to the proceedings. But if that weren't enough, the game also had 4-player multiplayer, allowing you and your mates to battle things out on the same screen. The idea of being able to play a deathmatch without having to lug PCs around to mates' houses for a LAN party really appealed and offered many their first taste of deathmatch experience. But this integral feature nearly didn't happen, with the Stamper brothers, who owned Rare, actually saying no multiplayer, seeing it as too frivolous to use in the time that they had to write the game. However, Martin Hollis, the lead director of the game, and some of the key members secretly disagreed with the Stamper brothers and so worked on it anyway. Sadly, a few things were left out in the final game, such as originally they had drawn all the actors who had played Bond to be selected in the multiplayer experience, allowing gamers to fight it out and know once and for all who was the best Bond. Unfortunately, at last minute, the owners of the Bond rights, smelling lawsuits, asked them to remove the feature. According to the developer team, they had one last decisive battle, the first to 100 death kills, before removing it from the game. And for those interested, Roger Moore won by 1 point. The game turned out to be a resounding success, with countless awards and Edge giving the game 9 out of 10. If that weren't enough, Rare churned out another classic in November this year in 1997 with Diddy Kong Racing. This basically took Mario Kart but mixed it with the Rare magic. It may not have had the same star-studded racers of Mario Kart, but in many ways it surpassed Mario Kart, particularly in the single-player game. It was criticised at the time for being too similar to Mario Kart, but in my view it's different enough to stand it apart from the Mario game. Other games of note in 1997 were Snowboard Kids and Yoshi's Story, although the latter was a huge disappointment, being far too simple when compared to the original SNES Yoshi Island game. On to 1998, and Nintendo's machine continued the classic lineup roster of games with more game gems. First was 1080 Degrees Snowboarding, which was based on the same programming team who did Wave Racer. The game had great in-game physics, and the game was the perfect balance of arcade thrills mixed with simulation, offering stacks of tricks to master and race options. Edge gave the game 8 out of 10. Then in June, Rare was back again with another gem of a game called Banjo-Kazooie, which had you play a bear called Banjo and his friend who was a big red bird called Kazooie, who must rescue Banjo's sister from Toonie, the evil witch Gruntilda. The game was a great platforming game that was stacked full of fun and charm, with great level design and humour throughout. It was hugely popular on release, selling over 2 million games and getting 5 out of 5 in GamePro magazine. If that wasn't enough to make gamers weep with joy on the N64, then in July 1998, F-Zero X was finally released, being another classic update that even surpassed the original game. It may have been basic to look at, but the sheer speed and vast array of fellow racers on the track more than made up for it. Also, the tracks were really well designed, making full use of the 3D environments that was simply not possible on the Mode 7 original SNES game. Edge gave the game 8 out of 10. But it was in November 1998 with the release of Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, that gamers finally got the dream of seeing Hyrule in full 3D. It was a lavish production involving multiple directors and development teams of 120 people working solely on this game. I remember playing this when it first came out and being simply mesmerised by the richly designed world being so open-ended. It truly was like entering another world. It was here that the power of what 3D gaming could do was most keenly felt. Edge quite rightly gave this game 10 out of 10. Then, in December 1998, after the success of Shadow of the Empire, LucasArts enlisted Factor 5 to do a sequel with the Rogue Squadron game. This was again a on-rails blaster and was the first time that you really felt you were part of the Star Wars universe on a console. The game was praised for its exciting and atmospheric gameplay. It was also one of the first N64 games to popularise the memory expansion pack. This was a device that you could buy that added 4 MB storage for graphics and so improved the game's graphics even further. Nintendo Power Magazine gave the game 9 out of 10. December also saw quirkier titles released, with Hey You Pikachu. Yes, you too could spend £70 to talk to a yellow fat rat. The game came with a microphone peripheral that allowed you to talk to Pikachu, giving him simple commands and things to do. Part Tamagotchi Cyber Pet and part minigame, the game also came bundled with a special edition console that had the lovable yellow Furble on the console. The game was poorly received, quite frankly, at the time, with the gaming press and many deciding it was a poor game and simple cash-in on the Pokemon craze. Also this month, Mario Party was released by Hudson Soft. This had you play up to 56 devilishly fun mini-games set on a board game. The game lived up to its name, being a great party game to play with the family and friends that would have everybody in stitches of laughter. Famitsu magazine gave the game 8 out of 10. By 1999 it was clear that Nintendo had lost the console war to Sony, and with Sega's new Dreamcast console being released, things looked pretty bleak for the Nintendo 64 console. But still, this year would bring some great additional games. The first game released in January this year was Super Smash Bros. The game was a brainchild of HAL Laboratories' Masahiro Sakurai, who had previously worked on many of the SNES Kirby games. He wanted to do a 4-player beat-em-up, but knew that beat-em-ups didn't sell that well, and thought by using Nintendo characters it would be a great original spin on the genre. The game started out as an unofficial tech demo, but then when it was finally approved, it was seen by HAL Games and Nintendo as only a low-budget Japanese release. But the game was so popular that it became a worldwide phenomenon, with gamers loving finally being able to see which of Nintendo's characters can whoop ass. In March 1999, HAL Laboratories came back again with Pokemon Snap, a wonderful, original and quirky on-rails wildlife photography game that had you ride around the Pokemon Wildlife Park and take pictures of up to 150 cute little Pokemon critters. Actually, as bad as it sounds, the game is really good and quite addictive. And the game was, quite rightly, positively received on the time of release, with the Famitsu magazine giving the game 34 out of 40. The following month, in April 1999, HAL Laboratories were back again with Pokemon Stadium, which allowed you to hook your N64 to a Pokemon Game Boy game cartridges via a transfer pack and allowed you to fight your furry critters on the big screen. I guess it was a dream come true for poker-obsessed gamers around the world, but for the rest of us it left us a bit scratching our heads, wondering what all the fuss was about. The developer, Treasure, had already given gamers a treat on the N64 with Mischief Makers in 1997, but it was their second N64 game, Bang-I-Oh, released in September this year, which finally turned gamers' heads. The game was a frantic blaster with a constant action-fest thrill ride that just doesn't let up for a moment. Rare was back again in November this year with Donkey Kong 64. This was the first game to require the 4MB expansion pack as standard for the game to work. But for those few gamers who hadn't jumped ship onto another console, they would be pleasantly surprised with the solid fun that the game provided. It was far from perfect though, with tedious unbalanced parts of the games in my opinion that spoiled the enjoyment for many. The following month in December 1999, Rare were back again with the often overlooked third-person adventure shooter called Jet Force Gemini. The game had lots of humour in it, with tongue-in-cheek references to a multitude of science fiction films. The game got 8.1 out of 10 in IGN, with them citing clunky controls and frame rate slowdown. It's a shame though that this game has never been re-looked at by Rare, since as perhaps the game's only failing was that it was too ambitious on what they were trying to release on the N64 hardware. By the year 2000, the final death knell could be heard, with the writing truly on the wall for Nintendo's new console, and already Nintendo concentrating their efforts on their new console that they plan to release called the GameCube, which would be released the following year. But despite this, the N64 had some great games still up its sleeve. In April of 2000, Nintendo released Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. This used a slightly upgraded game engine to Ocarina of Time, using the expansion pack to work as standard. The game was a lot more darker and more intelligent storyline, and ingenious use of puzzles around time travel of a 3-day life cycle, with masks that allow you to change into a variety of creatures. The game was positively received at the time, with Edge giving it 9 out of 10, and IGN gave it 9.9 out of 10. Rare's penultimate game on the N64 was a follow-up to GoldenEye, in all but license name. Called Perfect Dark, it instead set things in the future of 2023, where you play a secret agent, Joanna Dark, on a mission to save the president. The game was an arduous development for the Rare team, as they tried to be too ambitious with the game, and it resulted with many key members of Rare who had worked on GoldenEye to leave Rare and set up their own development studio called Free Radical Design, which would go on to do the Time Splitters games before going into administration and bought by Crytek. Martin Hollis, who was director of the project, also left before Perfect Dark was released and set up the development of the studio Tsunami, and has gone on to create such low-key games as Zendoku, Go Puzzle and Bonsai Barber. Perfect Dark, however, was released, and it was a critical success, improving on GoldenEye in almost every way. It was a shame that it was released too late in the day, with many gamers missing out on this great game. In August 2000, Paper Mario, or Super Mario RPG 2 as it's known in Japan, was released by Intelligent Systems, who had previously made a name for itself with the Fire Emblem games. This took the traditional RPG game but mixed it with the Mario platform gameplay, giving it an enjoyable mix of genres. Electronic Game Monthly magazine gave the game 9.33 out of 10. Treasure's final game released on the N64 was the best, called Sin and Punishment. It was an on-rail shooter that pushed the N64 to its absolute limits. The game still looks stunning to this day, and is still one of the best shooters around. It's just such a shame, with its limited release, with most gamers moving on to other systems, that this game has been missed by many. Rare's final game for the N64 was something a bit different, called Conker's Bad Fur Day. Originally it was going to be Conker's Adventure, and it was going to be yet another cutie pie platform game. But Rare began to become concerned that the game wouldn't be original enough to stand out. So instead, Rare's designer, Chris Seaver, asked to revamp the graphics and attitude of the game to make it more adult, taking on a more South Park style game, South Park being a popular cartoon at the time. The game was brilliant, quite frankly, managing to parody almost everything you can think of, and with the bizarrest collection of imaginative enemies. After all, where else can you play a game where you have to beat a mighty poo and a level boss that has his own theme song? The gaming press universally loved the game, but unfortunately the game did sell poorly, with most adult gamers having left Nintendo system for the Sony machine at that time. In summary, the Nintendo machine may not have reached its full potential due to coming out too late and some poor decisions made by Nintendo regarding not realizing the world of gaming had moved on with the advent of CD quickly enough. But they also revolutionized many aspects of the console gaming taken for granted today. They had the 4 game controllers able to connect, analog controller, and they were the first to install a rumble pack. So for the 30 million people around the world who bought the console, it remains for many one of their all-time favourite machines, with many of its exclusive games being on multiple all-time lists of both gamers and gaming press alike. Wow, that was quite an episode, wasn't it? Anyway, look out for my next episode where we take a look at the world of PC gaming. So until next time, see you later.